Shalom, I am Rabbi Michael Panitz, the Rabbi of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia, speaking to you from the pulpit of our synagogue. I'm going to speak to you on the subject of the birth of a nation, then, and then, and now. 3 moments in time. Why is the Bible made up of stories as well as laws? Because the stories present human situations that rhyme with our own. We recognize the rhyme and we learn from it. Or at least we should. That's the challenge. In our Jewish calendar, we are now, 2 weeks before Passover, recapitulating an inflection point in the early history of our people. This weekend, we observe the new moon of Nisan, the month of the spring, the month of Passover. That was a turning point in our birth as a nation. After 9 of the 10 plagues, we were still languishing in Egypt, still slaves, but beginning to be able to imagine our freedom. At that very moment, narrated in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, which we read this coming Sabbath, God speaks about an apparently extraneous subject, but in fact, one that is deeply connected to the quest for freedom. God commands us to observe a lunar calendar. The new moon happening at that time will be the start of our year. How is that related to freedom? Consider, the Egyptians had a solar calendar. Thanks to the norms of their geography, they experienced a significant regularity of nature, the annual flooding of the Nile. They succeeded in timing the interval between that event from one year to the next. Doing so, they arrived at a sophisticated insight that the year is 365 days long. Truly a significant cultural achievement. Living in Egypt, who would want to reckon time differently? Climate-wise, the moon was hardly relevant. But the Israelites were told to declare their cultural independence and to reckon their years by the moon. Still in the house of slaves, they were being schooled to think about their journey through time from the standpoint of autonomy. The physical journey would follow, but the mental preparation had to begin with this basic reorientation of self and community in the dimension of time. Once set free, the Israelites were not out of danger. Pharaoh released them, but within a few days, he regretted his loss of free labor, and he sent his chariots to overtake them. The Bible narrates that the mortal danger to the children of Israel only abated with the miracle of the divided waters. In crossing through the sea, the Israelites finally crossed to freedom. Notice that becoming free was a multi-stage process. The first part was the birth of the nation with the original Passover. But then it had to be reconfirmed at the shores of the sea. As the Bible relates with great psychological insight, only when the Israelites saw the corpses of the soldiers who had been sent against them, only then did they believe in God and in Moses, God's servant. That is the pattern. That is the rhyme. It has happened again and again in human history. I will tell you two such episodes. The 2-generation-long process of winning and then securing American independence between 1775 and 1815, and the current saga of Ukraine. Historians note several causes of the War of 1812, but at its core, the war involved some very real fears by Americans that the British were seeking to reverse the verdict of Trenton, Saratoga, Cowpens, and Yorktown. There is justification for the expression that the War of 1812 was the Second American Revolution. In 1815, as in 1781, the victory of those seeking independence almost did not happen. The British burned the capital in 1814, as the Russians are burning Kiev today. People often lament the needless loss of life in the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the conclusion of the Treaty of Ghent that was supposed to end the war. But in fact, if the British had won the Battle of New Orleans, they would certainly have abrogated the peace treaty and resumed their war on American independence. That should not come as a surprise to us when we see Putin stepping up the shelling of Ukrainian cities and the murder of civilians, even as the negotiators conduct their verbal exercises in Turkey. Would-be conquerors don't make peace because the better angels of their nature tap them on the shoulder. They make peace when their cold calculus of force offers them nothing more promising. An independent nation of Ukraine was long a failed concept. Cossacks lost their first bid for independence in 1648, and they fell under the sway of the Russian Tsar and the Austrian Emperor for centuries. In 1917, amid the chaos of the Russian Revolution, Ukraine again sought independence, but lost its war against the Soviet Red Army by 1919. The communist dictator Stalin pursued a brutal Russification of Ukraine. He made war on the Ukrainian body as well as the Ukrainian soul. His collectivization of farms resulted in the deaths of 4 to 5 million Ukrainians from famine in the early 1930s. Despite the revival of Ukraine in the 1950s, when the Ukrainian Nikita Khrushchev became the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, there was no independence. Ukrainian resentment against Russian treatment continued to simmer. It grew far more intense in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. The Chernobyl connection made Ukrainians angry enough to put their bodies on the line for independence. In January 1990, 300,000 Ukrainians organized a human chain between Kyiv and Lviv for independence. Ukraine declared its independence on October 24, 1991, months before the dissolution of the USSR that December. In December, Ukraine held a referendum on independence, and over 90% of Ukrainian citizens at that time voted for independence. After the disintegration of the USSR, Ukraine was in no mood to join the proposed Russian-led confederation of successor states. Declaring independence is one thing, achieving viability is another. The economy of the newly independent state was in free fall at first. The country was also plagued by governmental corruption scandals and by the curtailment of the freedom of expression. The crossroads for effective Ukrainian independence were reached in 2004. The candidate calling for closer ties with the Russian Federation, Viktor Yanukovych, was declared the winner of the 2004 election by a small margin. But the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, alleged voter intimidation and irregularities in vote counting. Massive street demonstrations, known as the Orange Revolution, led the Supreme Court of Ukraine to declare the election results null and void. A second round of voting put the opposition leader in power. There have been more twists and turns, more threats to democracy and human rights since then. Moreover, tensions with Russia have risen ever since. Under Putin, Russia has whittled away Ukrainian independence, seizing Crimea in 2014, firing on Ukrainian naval vessels in the Kerch Strait between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and supporting separatist movements in the eastern part of the country known as the Donbass. Low-intensity warfare has been ongoing there prior to the current invasion. In recent years, Ukraine has tried to improve its human rights posture. It amended the Constitution in 2019, seeking alignment with the international standards of the West. Putin's response to this has grown from low-level violence to the massive attacks of the past month. But Ukraine has not fallen. Indeed, so far, it seems to have fought the much larger Russian military to a stalemate. Are we seeing the Fort McHenry moment in Kyiv when, quote, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there? We cannot know the future, but we can know that freedom and independence are often won only through perseverance and sacrifice. 1% of the Jewish population of Israel died in the Israeli War of Independence. We Jews understand sacrifice. As keepers of the 2,000-year-old hope only realized in 1948, we also understand the power of the quest for independence to forge identity. Our Jewish independence began in Egypt with the New Moon celebration, teaching us that we were not simply Egyptians of the Mosaic persuasion, but rather a people with its own destiny. Remembering the lessons of our history may well help us to navigate the crises of today and prepare for those of tomorrow. Shalom.